Welcome to Talk 39 in our series on Mark's Gospel. Today we're looking at chapter 13, verses 1 to 23, where Jesus prophesies the destruction of the temple. We'll deal with verses 24 to 37 next time. This is a difficult chapter, not least because of the strong convictions some Christians have about it. But my intention is not to make dogmatic assertions about how it should be interpreted, but to point out some of the problems of interpreting it and to see what key lessons we can learn from it for ourselves today. As we shall see, despite the NIV heading, Signs of the End of the Age, much of this chapter is not about the second coming of Christ, but about what Christians should do leading up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. That's not to say that none of the chapter relates to the second coming, but I want to confess at the outset my own personal scepticism about using passages like this to try to predict when the Lord may return. And this is based on three things. Firstly, the Lord himself said in verse 32, "No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor even the Son, but only the Father." Secondly, he also said in Acts 1 verse 7, just before he ascended into heaven, "It's not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority." Jesus told his disciples not to be concerned with such things, but to get on with the task of world evangelization. And thirdly, my scepticism is based on the fact that so many attempts to calculate the timing of Jesus' coming have proved wrong. It's not only the Jehovah's Witnesses who've made predictions which they have been compelled to recalculate, but sincere Christians like William Miller, a Baptist farmer who, based on his understanding of Daniel's prophecy, was convinced that Jesus would return on a particular day in 1842, and then readjusted his calculations to the same day in 1843. He later admitted that he was wrong, but said that if he'd had his time all over again, he would still have arrived at the same conclusion. And even in my own lifetime, I've seen Christians making radical changes to their lifestyle based on events taking place in and around Israel, as those of you who may remember the 6-Day War may remember. But having expressed my scepticism, let me now make it clear that I certainly do believe in the return of the Lord Jesus. In Acts 1, immediately after Jesus had told his disciples that it was not for them to know the timing of his coming, we read in verses 9 to 11, "After he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. 'Men of Galilee,' they said, 'why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way as you have seen him go into heaven.'" So his return will be personal, it will be physical, it will be visible. Of this we can be certain. But it's not for us to know when. So, with all this in mind, let's now make a start on our passage in Mark 13. We'll begin by considering 2 difficulties that make this chapter particularly hard to interpret, before looking at the historical context in which it is set. Firstly, then, interpreting the passage. The first problem arises from the 2 questions the disciples asked Jesus in the opening verses. Verses 1 to 4. As he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones! What magnificent buildings!" "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're all about to be fulfilled?" So in verse 1, one of them draws Jesus' attention to the size and beauty of the temple, to which Jesus replies in verse 2, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Then Peter, James, John and Andrew ask him privately, "When will these things be, and what will be the sign that they're all about to be fulfilled?" So Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, and the disciples ask him when it's going to happen and what sign there will be. Notice that here there is no reference to the second coming of Jesus. Not in Mark's account anyway. However, it's clear from Matthew's account that his disciples clearly connected very closely the destruction of the temple with the return of the Lord, because they ask him in Matthew 24:3, "When will this happen," the destruction of the temple, "and what will be the sign at your coming and of the end of the age?" So in his reply, Jesus is answering two questions. It's important to remember that. Two questions which in the disciples' minds are closely related. One about the destruction of the temple and the other about the second coming. But when we try to interpret the passage, it's not always clear which parts of Jesus' answer relate to which of these two questions. What does seem clear is that much of Jesus' answer related to the destruction of the temple and not to the second coming. How much, if any, refers to the second coming is a matter of debate, but more of that later. The second difficulty that arises when we seek to interpret the chapter is deciding which parts are to be taken literally and which are to be taken symbolically. Although much of the passage is, in my view, clearly to be understood literally. For example, it's hard to see how "let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains," verse 14, how that can be interpreted symbolically. But some verses must surely be intended to be understood symbolically or metaphorically. For example, as we shall see next time, "The stars will fall from the sky," in verse 25, can hardly be taken literally any more than "the moon will be turned into blood" in Acts 2:20. Such expressions need to be understood as symbolizing cataclysmic events, the like of which have never been seen before. But how can we decide which way to understand any given verse, literally or symbolically? Part of the answer, at least, lies in the historical context in which the passage is set. We began by saying that what Jesus says in this chapter is in answer to questions about the destruction of the temple, which the disciples associated with the return of the Lord. To me, much, if not all, of Jesus' answer relates to the destruction of the temple, indeed of Jerusalem itself. So what do we know from history about this? It all began in a single year when in AD 69, 4 Roman emperors succeeded, one after another, each time with violence, murder and civil war. In AD 70, Titus, the adopted son of Vespasian, the last of these 4 emperors, entered Jerusalem, burnt the temple, destroyed the city, and crucified thousands of Jews. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us how, during the siege of Jerusalem, people were starving and ate their own babies to stay alive, how they fought each other for scraps of dirty food, and how more Jews were killed by other Jews than by the invading Romans. If you want to learn more about this, just Google AD 70 Siege of Jerusalem and you'll find plenty of stuff to read there. So, bearing in mind then the horrific events that would take place in AD 70, let's now attempt to solve the riddle of which verses refer to the destruction of Jerusalem and which, if any, refer to the second coming. We'll begin with verses 5 to 23, which, it seems to me, refer mainly to the years leading up to and shortly after the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, although some may possibly have a wider significance. I say this because of the immediate context. At the risk of boring you with repetition, Jesus had predicted the destruction of the temple and is now replying to the disciples' question in verse 4, when will these things happen and what will be the sign that they're all about to be fulfilled? That is, the destruction of the temple. Jesus' answer in verses 5 to 23 contains warnings about what was shortly to happen and instructions on what they should do, which can be summarized as follows. Watch out for deceivers. Don't be surprised by international turmoil and natural disasters. Expect to be persecuted. Take appropriate action when the time comes. We'll look at all those in a little more detail now. Watch out for deceivers. You'll find that in verses 5 and 6 and 21 to 22. Verses 5 and 6, Jesus said to them, watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. Verses 21 and 22, at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and miracles to deceive the elect, if that were possible. Of course, the verses could refer to any time in church history, including the period leading up to the Lord's return. But bearing in mind the context in which they are set, it seems that Jesus' primary intention was to warn his disciples about what would happen in their own lifetime. Don't be surprised by international turmoil and natural disasters. You'll find that in verses 7 to 8. When you hear of wars and rumours of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. It's easy to assume, as many have, that these things are to be taken as signs of Jesus' near return. But again, the context suggests otherwise. In fact, all these things have been happening throughout church history and are certainly very evident right now. But Jesus doesn't say the end is near. He says the end is still to come. And as we shall see next time, at the end of the chapter, Jesus says, you do not know. We won't know when he is coming. Even Jesus didn't know. And that's precisely why we need to be ready. Meanwhile, expect to be persecuted. Verses 9 to 14. Jesus says, you must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. and the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at the time, for it's not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Again, all of these things could be said of almost any period in church history. They were certainly relevant during the lifetime of the disciples, and no doubt will be right up to the time of the Lord's return. So there's no need to see them as exclusively relevant to the second coming. But there are two things in this passage I feel I need to make special comment on, as in people's thinking, they're usually associated with and seen as signs of the second coming. The first is in verse 10, where Jesus says the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Now, the Greek word for first is proton. This can mean either first in time or first in importance, or both. The immediate context in Mark, where Jesus is talking about his disciples being persecuted as they witness for him, suggests to me that he is stressing the importance of preaching the gospel whatever happens. And of course, this is applicable throughout the church age, and is something Jesus emphasizes in Acts 1 verses 6 to 8, which we've already mentioned. Not for you to know the times or the seasons the Father's put under his own authority, but you be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. This is so important that the end will not come until the gospel is preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. That's from Matthew's account, chapter 24 and verse 14. So this verse does have a very real application to the second coming. But Jesus is stressing the importance of worldwide evangelization rather than seeing it as a sign of his coming. The second is in verse 14, where Jesus says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it doesn't belong, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So what is this abomination that causes desolation? It was first prophesied in Daniel 9 verse 27 and is believed by some to have been fulfilled in 168 BC when Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig to Zeus on the temple altar in Jerusalem. However, since this took place before the coming of Jesus, it cannot be what he was referring to in this passage, which was yet future. Bearing in mind the context, it's far more likely that Jesus was referring to what happened in AD 70, when the Roman general Titus, we've already mentioned him, placed an idol on the site of the burnt-out temple just a few years after the destruction of Jerusalem. Now that, of course, doesn't rule out the possibility of another fulfillment in the future, but in my view, the Bible is by no means clear about this, and it would be very unwise to be dogmatic. And some people really are so dogmatic about these things. Next, verses 15 to 23. Take appropriate action when the time comes near. Let no one on the roof of his house go down or enter the house to take anything out. Let no one in the field go back and get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those days will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning, when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "Look, there he is," do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and miracles to deceive the elect, if that were possible. So be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time. At the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, the danger was imminent. Jesus' instructions are specifically related to that situation. The basic message is, get out quick. Don't let anything delay you. You will never have seen anything like it. Things are going to be terrible. Don't let anyone deceive you or distract you. But now, it's time for me to summarize my understanding of how these verses apply to us today. We'll be saying more about this next time, but remember, this is just a summary. 1. Because these verses apply initially to the period before AD 70, they contain some specific instructions, particularly, for example, verses 15 to 18, that relate only to that period. 2. However, since what the disciples were about to experience then were only the beginning of birth pains, verse 8, it follows that similar things would continue to happen throughout the whole church age, and that, with the exception of the specific instructions I've just referred to, the broad principles of what Jesus was teaching continue to be relevant to us today. 3. Because what Jesus is teaching here has been relevant throughout church history, there is no need to see the whole passage as relating directly to the second coming. And 4, the parts that do appear to have a bearing on it must not be interpreted as signs, something which Jesus makes clear in the closing verses of the chapter, as we shall see next time. So next time we'll be looking at verses 24 to 37. That will be the last talk before we take a break for the rest of August. So I encourage you in the coming week to read Mark 13 and prayerfully consider what I've been saying today, and prepare your thinking for what I might say next time. God bless you.